So in this lecture, we'll examine other domains of culture that fairy tales have influenced heavily. Primarily ballet as it ascends as the pastime of the aristocracy at the court of King Louis XIV, and how it follows a similar adaptive and popular trajectory as the fairy tale itself, especially in the late 19th century, where the fairy tale becomes the inspiration and centerpiece for iconic pieces of Russian ballet such as Sleeping Beauty, the Nutcracker, and Swan Lake. The protagonist heroines differ greatly from their literary counterparts of the same era. And in comparison, we will look at Andersen's Red Shoes and how the liberating aspects of dance and its history have been associated with ideology and even considered to be morally dangerous. Finally, we will look at the recent critically acclaimed film by Darren Aronofsky, Black Swan from 2010, and how it is technically innovative, but ultimately expresses a very objectifying and traditional trope from the 19th century in its blended retelling of Swan Lake and the Dying Swan. So our bodies carry with us our story, the injuries and repetitive actions that we created that have created the aches, the hunching, the proud walk, or other ways in which we move. If you think about it, how many of you were told not to slouch when you were little? What's the reasoning behind this, or not to, or to look people in the eye, or to give a firm handshake? There's the assumption that the other person will assume things about you, and whether you have been brought up in the right way, in a civilized manner. It's the civilization or disciplining of your body. So this is where we return to the courts of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who employed also Charles Perrault, our author of fairy tales and advisor to the court. At the same time, the Italian tales that were being transformed into fairy tales, ballet was similarly adopted and becoming a favorite pastime of the king. For its origins, we would need to go further back to when the first dance instructors were imported from Italy in the early 16th century, and this import soon became symbolic for refinement and social status and was practiced by royalty as one of their leisure activities. Over time, however, it evolved into a system of complex pirouettes, demi-points, and other movements as it takes on its own unique vocabulary and regimented formal training. So we see in Norbert Elias's civilizing process being applied here to bodies, much like Michel Foucault has argued through the disciplining of bodies via torture in the penal system to create nation states. Ballet here instructed the refinement that rejected the vulgar movements of the body in exchange for a disciplined civility. By 1661, ballet was codified in its techniques, and the royal pastime became a professional endeavor, each dancer showcasing their abilities, often with ballets written specifically for a unique performer. The show moved from the palace rooms and onto an Italian stage or Italian format. It was a stage raised above a frontal audience. And by the early 1800s, Romanticism began to influence ballet, and it was at this time that it was really epitomized in the figure of the iconic dancer Marie Taglioni. She was considered by many to be too skinny, long-limbed, and pale to dance, but undeterred, her father wrote a ballet for her to showcase her talents, which really were quick footwork and superb point techniques. It changed what audiences expected of ballets. These were light, quick moves, and it set a different mood for ballet masters and dancers. And so when you typically think of a ballet dancer, you are most likely thinking of the standard set by this romantic icon. It was then at the end of empires before the First World War and the revolutions that deposed kings for democracies that we find the rise of the Russian ballet imitating the court culture of the West as the power and relevance of their own court grew ever more distant from its people. And these grand ballets are beyond their art and attempt to maintain, reestablish, and demonstrate the power and prestige of the court of the Russian Tsar. A means by which artistic entertainment expressed the dominance of civility and the regimented order of the empire over the popular movements of democracy. In Katie Canton's book on rediscovering the fairy tale through dance, she focuses on Marius Petipa, who's a French-trained Belgian now known as the father of Russian ballet, and his turn towards fairy tale subjects because they provided the framework of empire in instructing subjects how they should behave. After the reforms of Alexander II and his abolishment of serfdom, unrest and nationalism led to his assassination and a crackdown by his successor, Alexander III, who instituted some counter reforms. Ballet offered a diversion in which the culture of the court was reinstated, specifically designed for the aristocracy, but as a spectacle for the people to wonder at it. It provided them an extended time in which to dream of their dominance. And it was during this period that Petipa directs some of the most beloved ballets, such as Sleeping Beauty, the Nutcracker, and Swan Lake. The Sleeping Beauty is a celebration of the courtly culture, the empire at its height. It is a grand ballet that features and recreates the past on stage, an entire court, much like the Nutcracker also does. The ideology of empire becomes apparent in form as the ballerinas form regimented, disciplined lines, often acting as a single line, synchronized in formation, and each shows off their prowess as if they were being marched out on a military parade. The purpose to instruct, delight, and metaphorically express instruments of aristocratic power. It is very similar to the fairy tale of Perrault in this aspect, as well as the superficial nature of the tale that is here exchanged for spectacle. Because much like the structure Prop has found, an initial villainy occurs in the first act. On her 20th birthday, Aurora is now to choose a man and dances in front of 4 princes who block her way after she seeks to return to her parents. She takes each of their hands, but then lets us go, or let's go. In a strong arabesque, she takes each of their hands, but then lets go, in a strong arabesque showing her independent spirit. Unlike Perrault, whose protagonists often were docile, chaste, and passive and waiting upon rescue, here we have a strong physical Aurora who chooses her prince and then, even still, demonstrates her ability to stand on her own. An old woman wanders into the court to give her flowers, a spindle hidden inside. She pricks her finger and falls asleep. The old woman reveals herself to be Carabosse, an evil fairy. So the freedom of movement of Aurora up until the pricking demonstrates her strong will in a fracture within the imperial court, as the younger generation, particularly women, appears to be virile and craving, protecting their independence. Despite the pomp of costumes and scenery, our eyes are fixed on the disruptive force of Aurora, who refuses to acknowledge the princes, nor is she passive or complacent. The next act opens to a forest where there's a prince hunting with his retinue. The prince's dance, in contrast, is constrained to the center of the stage, so that he remains constantly in the center of the attention, albeit it is a severely limiting position. While Aurora was free to roam lightly about the stage in the first act, the prince here must keep formation. Similarly, the fairy Lilac enters and coaxes and convinces the prince to come after Aurora, who appears as a vision, dancing slowly, slumberly, sort of in a state that is not unlike she was in the first act. So here the fairy becomes the mover of plot. The males are like chess pieces that need to be moved into position. As they arrive at the castle, Carabosse is guarding there, and she is chased away by the fairies. And as the prince enters the bedchambers, the web of sleep is lifted and a kiss awakens her. Now, Act 3 greatly diverges from Perrault's storyline. We no longer have an ogress as a mother-in-law that would really paint the royalty in a bad light, but rather the audience is treated to the regalia and pomp of a royal wedding. Invited are several of Perrault's other well-known fairy tale figures, such as Bluebeard, Puss in Boots, also Bluebeard, Little Red Riding Hood, and some bears and boys along with Lilac and other fairies. It's a recreation of the courtly splendor of Louis XIV's court and all its civilizing fixtures and the ideology and instruction that they stand for, as ballet does as well. So as we discussed before, when fairy tales institute a certain aesthetic or way of being for gender roles, they can become fetishized and exacerbated as the young turn into adults. For the late 19th century, young, sleeping, or dead women appealed to an aesthetic of an ideal who is of a woman who is passive and compliant to the point of lifelessness, while males liked to see themselves as adventurous and lively. So the opposite of this was then projected onto women and fetishized as desirable. The Sleeping Beauty of the ballet pushes against this characterization, and despite her slumber playing a role, she's more active, and in part, this is because of the form. Again, one can sense the imperialistic impulse starting to break, and even though there are still instances in which the aristocracy is shown to be in command or in power, such as the awakening kiss and the way in which the Sun King runs the ceremonies, the whole third act sacrifices plot for spectacle. Now, in the story of the Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen, we see this more with dance as a warning against the vanity of wanting to stick out or the dangers of immodesty. It's a very different cultural background. Andersen named the figure Karen after his half-sister who worked as a prostitute, and the Red Shoes really were a common indicator for the profession. It is not the first time that we see dance as something dangerous, and it continues to be a trope even to today. In post-World War I Berlin, the only things that were illegal then were within the city limits were dancing and fishing with hand grenades. So dancing was something associated with the drug culture of the time, and it was thought that dancing would cause a state of hyperarousal. And new wild forms of dance were challenging old ideologies of the ruling class. So the civility of the waltz was prescribed in Nazi Germany, while jazz and Lindy were very popular. They were also outlawed. Just recently in Iran, a young woman was arrested for posting an Instagram video without wearing a headscarf, and other women began filming themselves dancing in protest. And it's an example of biopolitics, where morality is used to oppress here in the form of restricting public expression of gender, sexuality, and control over one's body. The demands for the control of the body in ballet aligns with the demands for the control of the body in biopolitical means and goals of moving from prescribed laws into the self-restraint of the individual as part of a trajectory towards the civilization of a society into a nation state. So times have changed since the classical period of ballet, as the classical ballet prized the ethereal quality of ballet, and therefore fairy tale narratives were useful in connecting and adapting an aristocratic form to a nationalistic movement like folk and fairy tales did. And it really appropriated but also changed them, perhaps robbing them of some of their most poignant and rebellious aspects, like the killing of wicked royalty, like the ogress. So following this classical revival, modern dance distanced itself from this lightness of the courtly fairy tale and used narratives with deep emotion, bare feet, and a groundedness of the dancers to the world, the adult drama. And for this, they were adopting more serious works of tragedy from Greek mythology. So following this period, the postmodern or Judsonites evolved dance to be less linear in its narrative and adopted experimental forms. In the 60s and 70s, these were aspects of pastiche, irony, and nostalgia in the choreography. And the dancers would often acknowledge the formal function of dance, abstraction, and austerity. Movements were undistorted by theatrics, and efforts were made to keep the ballet in a realistic, anti-illusory method of storytelling. So since the 80s, however, there has been a return to narrative dance that includes the notion of history and stories that are full of emotion. Consumerism really enters into the dancescape at this point, in which the dancers themselves are, in a way, products for consumption. Fairy tales are used once again. They provide a narrative frame that everyone knows in a traditional history in ballet itself. But the illusions of the fairy tale are often held with some skepticism, suggesting some psychological phenomenon that the fairy tale represents. There are ironic moments where the narrative comments on prettiness, happiness, and childhood, and some are deconstructed even, where texts are rearranged. And the audience is constantly reminded that they are watching a performance where the narration does not match the action. So Black Swan really demonstrates these impulses while also some regressive aspects, perhaps because of the dominance of the male gaze in film, as we have a return to an imperial aesthetic of the young woman as frail, fragile, and the ideal woman perfected not in her performance, but in her death, in that constraint and control of the figure. So this brings us to the question as to whether the film Black Swan from 2010 transgresses, shifts boundaries, or can be seen as an act of revolution in that it takes on dance. In a way, it's a horror film, a psychological horror film, one in which we see the harrowing descent of a young woman, a perfectionist, splitting into two, and her victimization really by narcissistic mothers, directors, and other competitors. The dance itself becomes symbolic of something dangerous. It is perhaps the very existence of the film that reminds us of the continued existence of that aristocratic class that has now shifted from featuring the individual artist or ballerina towards the ballet as a product. And each person is just part of that consumable. They're used up for our entertainment. I often hear the argument that the film is about the obsessed artist who pushes herself to perfection, but I see it as a person who's emptied out of their individual agency, much more akin to a puppet that is bullied, coerced, and seduced into a role, waiting to be a real person, emptied of the remarkable qualities that make her unique, left only into this role of sacrificing herself to this ideal at the end. The film demonstrates the releasing of the passionate woman as dangerous. So in this split, the dark swan is envious and lustful. It's an archetype that's contained within the same body, split sort of like in a Jungian sense, which has influenced all of script writing since its inception. And it's one of the three, she really produces one of the three stereotype roles that women can have. We already have one that's taken up by her actual mother and this mother, but then we have within her sort of the naive virgin or the knowing seductress, where the naive is set in a state of perpetual childhood, and the second here in a adulthood sort of that's cast as sexually dangerous and uncontrollable that ultimately leads to death. So in this lecture, we discussed a bit of the corresponding history between ballet and fairy tales, how they have been used and adapted to dance to promote or rebel against authority, and how ballet rejects the passive body ideal of women, and how dance reclaims personal energy or agency and authority at the height of the fairy tale theme popularity in the dancing world. It rejects the stereotypes of the passive ideal woman of the time in visual art. In contemporary dance, productions have become more influenced by the commodification of art, so that has become palatable as an economic venture. And in film, however, due to its aspirations as both a mass medium and visual artistic medium, we see the objectification of the woman. Here it is this reassertion of the passive female form that's sold as an artistic ideal of perfectionism in the film Black Swan.